Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. If you're new to my channel, hello, my name is Gabby and welcome to my strange little YouTube channel. I got so many people in my last video saying they missed that intro and I promised I'd do it again. So there you go. Well, in my last video I said that for the entire month of September I was going to be doing solved cases. So I was brainstorming different cases to do and it hit me that it would be an absolute sin if I did solve September and I didn't include the murder of Pearl Bryan. This case is considered solved even though there's a lot of aspects to it that are still unsolved to this day, but they caught the people responsible, so it is by definition considered solved. This is a case that I have known about pretty much my entire life. I was a fetus researching this case. This case takes place in my mom's family's neck of the woods. This has become a mystery, a ghost story from northern Kentucky and southern Ohio. When I first started researching for this case, I was not prepared for how many rumors there are, lies there are, false accusations there are about this case. It is pretty much impossible to completely separate fact from fake. And after my research was done and I completed everything, my conclusion is that the only people who know 100% what happened are the three people involved in this case, and they have all been dead for over 120 years. This video is the best research I could have done about this case. I got most of my information from newspaper articles right after it happened, so I feel like I did a pretty good job piecing everything together. So, with all that being said, let's just get into the case. Back in the day, if your family was wealthy, they were well known, you were attractive by people's standards, you were friendly with men, you would become pretty popular. That was Pearl Bryan. Pearl Bryan was a 22-year-old woman living in Greencastle, Indiana, the daughter of a wealthy farmer, the youngest of 12 children, only 7 who are still alive at this point. A graduate of the Greencastle High School class of 1892, who would go on to become one of the most desired women in her town, and the main character in one of the most haunting tales of her time. Her very good friend, who was also her second cousin, a 20-year-old named William Wood, decided that in spring of 1895 he was going to introduce his cousin Pearl to his friend from university, a man named Scott Jackson. Unknown to most anyone who knew him, Scott had previously been in some serious trouble, from embezzling from the railroad to disorderly conduct involving a woman of the night, or also known as a prostitute. Scott Jackson's family was also very wealthy, so because of this, he was accepted as a suitor for Pearl pretty much immediately, and before he left for school that October, Pearl became pregnant. Pearl did not want to be pregnant though, because Scott did not want to marry her. Especially back in those days, it was extremely frowned upon to have a child and not be married first. She confided in her cousin William, telling him that she was pregnant, she didn't know what to do, she needed to figure something out. So William sent a letter to Scott, Scott sent one back, they sent a few back and forth, and in these letters they were discussing ways to induce a miscarriage. It is said that Pearl tried all of these ways, they didn't work, and she was still pregnant. On January 28th, Pearl left by train telling her parents she was heading to Indianapolis to visit a family friend named Mrs. Fisher, about 50 miles east. She instead went to a hotel called the Indiana House in Cincinnati, about 150 miles southeast, and was assigned room 114. The first night, Scott was not able to see her, and then the next morning, Scott called the hotel and talked to her. The next day, she left the hotel with Scott and his friend from school, Alonzo Walling. At this time, she was 5 months pregnant, and when she left home, that would be the last time her parents would ever see their daughter alive. As the story goes, when Scott and Pearl finally were together at the end of January, Scott attempted to perform an abortion on her, and he obviously had no idea what he was doing. Although abortions were illegal back in the day, some people did know how to perform them. Not Scott Jackson though. It is unknown if this is true or not, but according to some friends at his university, They said that Scott was once very, very drunk and that he told them that Pearl was pregnant and that he was going to attempt to kill her, and that he was talking about all the ways he was going to try to get rid of Pearl and his unborn child. One of those ways was he was going to force feed her a large amount of drugs and make it look like she took her own life. And then he said that if that didn't work, he was going to murder her, hide her body, and then make it look like she completely disappeared. His first attempt to perform an abortion was supposedly done with chemicals, most likely cocaine, because that was what was found in her system later on. And also because a chemist later came forward saying he supplied him with it, of course not knowing what it was intended for. Cocaine back in the day wasn't an illegal drug. It was used as a medication, but it was still known that using enough of it could kill you. Then it is said that he tried to use dental tools to perform this abortion. That, of course, didn't work, and by this time, she was bleeding profusely. And now, this is where the story takes an even more twisted and darker turn. Scott, Alonzo, and Pearl, still losing blood, traveled across the Ohio River to northern Kentucky. They didn't travel alone though. They hired a driver named George Jackson, no relation to Scott Jackson, to drive them on what would be Pearl's last ride. This poor man, George Jackson, had no idea what he had gotten himself into. He had no idea what was going on, and he became very scared very quickly because as he was driving, all he heard was Pearl moaning in pain from the back seat. He told them he couldn't drive any farther, and this is when, according to him, Alonzo threatened him and told him he better keep driving. If you're not familiar with the geography of the area, Cincinnati, Ohio is right on the bottom of Ohio. So to get to the neighboring state of Kentucky, it's just, depending where you are in Cincinnati, a short drive. It could be 2 minutes to 15 minutes. It's not a long drive at all. They drive to a secluded area in Fort Thomas, Kentucky, one so secluded that no one was going to see what they were going to do next. At this point, George runs off as Scott and Alonzo are dragging Pearl off. This is where they murdered Pearl Bryan. At this point, she had been losing a lot of blood, so she was most likely incoherent, but she was still alive. And they killed her by decapitating her with dental tools. The same dental tools that they were trying to perform the abortion with earlier. Well, they knew that she was still alive when she was decapitated because after her body was found, they brought in an expert to examine the area, and he said that the way the blood splattered and how some parts of the ground were soaked with 6 to 9 inches of blood, her blood had to have been pumping at the time she died, so she was alive when they decapitated her, which is absolutely horrific to even think about. So, Scott Jackson couldn't perform a successful abortion, but he could perform a successful act of pure evil. Her body was later found by the owner of the land, John B. Locke, on February 1st, behind what is now the YMCA in Fort Thomas, Kentucky, 200 feet off the Alexandria Turnpike. When they first found Pearl's body, they had no idea it belonged to Pearl Bryan because her head was missing. It was only a body. They identified her by her shoes, a shoe brand named Lewis and Hayes, sold in Greencastle, Indiana, and the owner confirmed that those were the shoes he sold specifically to Pearl. The owner, L.D. Pook, ended up losing his business in July of 1896 because of the connection between his shoes and the murdered woman. They officially identified her on February 6th when they brought Pearl's bloody clothes to her mother to identify, and she verified that they were indeed Pearl's. Obviously, Pearl's cousin, William Wood, knew that Pearl had been out with Scott, so Scott and Alonzo were connected to the crime pretty quickly and were arrested at their boarding home on West 9th Street. Alonzo said that it was all Scott's idea to decapitate her and dispose of her body in a sewer, and that Scott took her head because he said he had other uses for it. Alonzo said he didn't know what he meant by this, but that Pearl's head was most likely in the Ohio River. Around mid-February, Pearl's father, mother, and two of her siblings, which was her sister Mabel and her brother Fred, came to Newport, Kentucky, and they were going to take her body back to a funeral home in Cincinnati so it could later be transported to Greencastle, Indiana for her actual funeral. Because her family was only going to be in town for a short period of time, this period of time was when police tried their hardest to locate Pearl's head because they wanted to give Pearl a proper burial. They were never able to locate her head though. During her funeral, they actually brought in both Scott and Alonzo to view the body, hoping if they saw the horror that they did, they would finally break down and tell exactly what happened and where her head was. According to a report, Jackson was terribly excited and nervously clasped and unclasped his hands. His eyes roved from one end of the body to the other, and he shook his head and sighed deeply. His face was terribly flushed, and he looked as though he might break down every second. On the other hand, Walling was, to all appearances, the coolest man in the room. He gazed at the corpse without a shiver, and looked around on the faces of those present. His only noticeable display of agitation was to tap his foot nervously on the floor. After that, Scott and Alonzo just kept going back and forth blaming the other person, never having a set story. They just kept making up lie after lie, and they would never tell exactly what happened with her head. During a conversation with Mabel, Pearl's sister, and Scott, Mabel said, "I ask you, Scott Jackson, to tell me what you have done with poor Pearl's head." Scott Jackson did not answer. "For the love of heaven, tell me what you have done with poor baby's head. Think of her mother if nothing else. I am going to her tonight and I want to tell her where her baby's head is." Scott Jackson says, "I can't tell you anything about it." Neither of them, Scott nor Alonzo, would budge. Both men were being kept in Cincinnati and had to be kept in their cell under strict watch. Not because people thought they were going to escape, but because so many people wanted them dead and were willing to do it themselves and not wait for a proper execution. They were set to be moved to a jail in Newport, Kentucky, and this terrified both of them because this jail in Newport, Kentucky was old, it was run down, security wasn't that great, and if somebody really wanted to get to Scott or Alonzo and get their hands on them themselves, they could probably do it, and this just scared them both to no end. The entire time they were locked up, they kept the same routine. They would blame each other, they would go back and forth, they would say they didn't know where her head was. There was always just different stories. They never had a set explanation for what happened. Well, the next year in early 1897, both Scott Jackson and Alonzo Walling were finally brought to trial. This was a trial that had everyone's attention. People were insanely eager to hear the outcome. Everyone was pretty familiar with who Pearl Bryan was, and people were just in shock that this happened. The hearing began at 9 a.m. and it didn't take long at all for the courthouse to be completely flooded with people wanting to catch a glimpse at the two men responsible for the heinous crime. Pearl's cousin, William Wood, was actually charged as an accomplice, but the charges were dropped because he agreed to testify against both Scott and Alonzo in court. The reason that William was looked as an accomplice is because the letters back and forth kind of talking about the abortion, he kind of egged it on also, and he's the one who introduced them together. Maybe he knew something was going to happen. It was just unsure exactly if he was completely involved with this entire thing or not. Now, as I told you multiple times, Scott and Alonzo just kept going back and forth, but let's talk about Scott and Alonzo's actual statements when they were told to sit down and write exactly what happened, what they said. On March 18th, Jackson and Walling were put together in a room with a table and chairs, given paper and pencils with an almanac to verify dates, and left to write their confessions. What they came up with surprised everyone. In separate statements, they told virtually the same story, beginning with Pearl Bryan's arrival in Cincinnati for the purpose of having an abortion. Walling contacted May Smith, his girlfriend at the time, for the name of an abortionist. She put him in touch with Dr. George Wagner of Bellevue, Kentucky, and arrangements were made to send Pearl to his house. On Wednesday, Walling met Pearl in Cincinnati and gave her directions. Pearl went to Dr. Wagner's by herself. On Thursday, Jackson and Walling went to Bellevue to deliver Pearl's valise. and on Friday they went back for the operation. There were complications from the beginning, and when Pearl appeared to be in pain, Wagner sent Jackson to Fort Myers drugstore for ergot. He administered the ergot, but it had no effect. He opened her dress and injected her with a clear liquid, then gave her some whiskey to drink. Pearl became unconscious, and after a few moments, Wagner said she was gone. They loaded her body into a vehicle and took her to a secluded spot. Dr. Wagner severed her head with a dissecting knife and wrapped it in a cloak. He drove Jackson and Walling to the bridge to Cincinnati. Then they went their separate ways. It is crazy that they both came up with the same story. Was this actually true? Was this false? I know they did talk to Dr. Wagner and they couldn't really connect him to anything. There was no evidence. Is this actually what happened? It's completely unknown. But it didn't take long, and Scott and Alonzo were both found guilty. They were actually offered a life sentence if they told where Pearl's head was located, but both men refused, and they were sentenced to death instead. They were sent to the gallows behind the Newport courthouse on March 20th of 1897. This would be the last public hanging in Campbell County, Kentucky. Their necks did not break during the hanging, so it took a few minutes for them to die due to asphyxiation. After they did, the crowd fell completely silent and the gallows were torn down following the execution. People in the area couldn't get enough of this case. It had sex, mystery, an unwanted pregnancy, a double life. It had everything, and people just viewed it as a juicy story. Of course, they were sad for Pearl, but it was interesting. They would even go to the place where Pearl's body was found, and they would take souvenirs like branches or gravel. And as horrible as it sounds, there were even gift shops that sold Pearl Bryan merchandise. Pearl Bryan was laid to rest on March 27, 1897 in Forest Hills Cemetery in the Bryan's family plot. It is tradition among people to lay a penny on her tombstone, always heads up. Many people for years would often chip away at her tombstone as a keepsake. This happened so often that the family eventually had to replace her tombstone altogether. In today's time, Pearl's head has still never been located. We have no idea what they did with it. But remember back in their statements that I was talking about, and they mentioned the valise? Well, a valise is a small travel bag. That small travel bag that they were talking about was located, and in that bag they found Pearl's hair and blood. According to a bartender at a saloon, he saw Scott in the saloon with that bag. He asked him if he was carrying a bowling ball in it because of how heavy and round it made the small bag. So it was theorized that Pearl's head was in that bag. They even asked Scott about this, and he was very vague about it. He was basically just like, oh, well, if there's blood in it and there's hair in it, then I suppose her head was in it. So obviously, out of everyone involved, Scott Jackson knew what happened to her head. Her head was in that bag, and that bag is currently on display at the Campbell County Historical Society if anyone wants to view it. Many professionals and people interested in the case believe Scott possibly brought the head back to his college to be cremated in the furnace of the cadaver room of the dental college he attended. Back in the day, dental students practiced on corpses and then cremated them when they were finished. So now we're going to get into a little bit of the rumors and speculations, because I can't bring up this case without talking about them, not because I'm trying to fuel any rumors, but this story has become a legend, a ghost story, and I have to kind of talk about those factors. You all are probably wondering why Scott and Alonzo never fully budged, why they never completely told the truth. Well, there is a speculation that Scott Jackson and Alonzo Walling, especially Scott Jackson, was involved in the occult. People think that possibly they never told the whole truth because they had some sort of an agreement with Satan. As the legend goes, Scott Jackson was deeply involved in the occult, and he used a slaughterhouse in Wilder, Kentucky to perform rituals. This slaughterhouse would go on to become the honky-tonk bar known as Bobby Mackey's. I did an entire paranormal video about my experiences at and after Bobby Mackey's. So if you want to go check that out, you can check that out down below in the description. It'll be there. If you don't know about Bobby Mackey's is one of the most haunted places in the entire world. It's the one place where Zach Bagans from Ghost Adventures will never set foot in again. It is a very negative place. The story goes that Scott used this slaughterhouse that would go on to become Bobby Mackey's as a place to perform rituals, and that possibly he brought back Pearl's head to this location, did a ritual with it, and then threw her head down the well that they used to dispose of the animal blood. This is a story that a lot of people believe when it comes to the case of Pearl Bryan because it is so talked about. I can guarantee that anyone who really knows about this case and hasn't done a whole ton of research believes this theory. Well, after doing my research, it is just a rumor. This whole speculation about their involvement in the occult was never brought up until 2001 when a book was written about the ghost stories at Bobby Mackey's. So it was never brought up throughout all of the 1900s. In my opinion, it is just another rumor. For multiple years, people found human skulls in northern Kentucky and southern Ohio. Crazy to think about that people just stumbled across skulls, but they did, and they would always bring them to authorities thinking they may be the skull of Pearl Bryan, but they never turned out to be. There was never DNA testing back then, but they knew that these skulls were not Pearl Bryan's because most of the time they were men's skulls. There are so many rumors surrounding this case. One huge rumor is that before Scott and Alonzo were hung, Alonzo gave the crowd the sign of the evil eye, and Scott told everybody in the crowd he was going to come back and haunt them. This was never brought up in newspapers. It definitely would have because it would have been a juicy story, but it was never brought up. So this was just a little tale that was made up through the years. The main question with this case is, where is her head? But there's also another question, and that is, whose baby was it? Yeah, there was talk that the baby she was pregnant with was not Scott Jackson's, that it was actually William Wood's. Yes, her second cousin. Now back then, getting pregnant and having sexual relations with your cousin was not as frowned upon, but you know. This wasn't just made up years later, this was actually brought up in court. Some of William's friends came forward saying that William bragged about his sexual relations with his cousin and that she was pregnant with his baby. William said that this was completely false. Scott actually told authorities that he never had intercourse with Pearl until after she said that she was pregnant. But I don't necessarily believe this because if she wasn't pregnant with Scott's baby, why was he so insistent on getting rid of it? Also, many people wonder why Alonzo had anything to do with this at all. I mean, he didn't know Pearl, this wasn't his baby, why was he even involved? Was he just an evil man? Or was Scott Jackson just extremely manipulative? That's what most people think. Although this case fascinates many, has become a mystery, a ghost story told during Halloween, a young woman still died and was never given a complete proper burial because two sick and twisted men who couldn't drop their egos to give a family just a little bit of peace. The main reason that I really wanted to talk about this case on my channel is to really make it known that this case is so much more than the ghost story that it has become in current times. This actually happened. A girl lost her life and there was an entire case around it. Yes, this case is horrific and gruesome and heartbreaking, but it's a case that I had to include in my Solved September series. If you have any other solved cases you want me to discuss in the series, put those requests down below in the comments. If you are not already subscribed, make sure to hit that subscribe button. I'm almost at 50K and I'm like so eager to hit 50K. I love you guys so much and we'll see you guys in my next video. Bye guys.
Where the violets fade and bloom, there sleeps my own Pearl Bryan, so silent in the tomb. She died not broken-hearted, nor from sickness did she fail, but in one moment parted from the home she loved so well.